behind all of this is a worldview challenge. There are, shall we say, some prevailing worldviews that have a vested interest in not examining any variables, because under the prevailing worldviews, people are ontologically LGBTQ, whatever they are, and they cannot change. So when we look for variables, it starts to break apart the worldview like a house of cards.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am excited to be joined today by Dr. Joseph Nicolosi. Dr. Nicolosi, thanks for jumping on here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I should say junior because your dad also, right? Dr. Joseph Nicolosi, I read one of his books maybe 25, 30 years ago, back in the day. And I'd love for you to just give maybe a quick overview, kind of your bio and background a little bit. We're going to be diving into some deep waters, deep topics around particularly male same-sex attraction. I wanted to talk to Dr. Nicolosi about, but yeah, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. And you mentioned my father, so maybe I should give a little bit of his background and I'll go into mine. So my father, who I am conveniently named after, it saves money on business cards. He was a clinical psychologist, and he started something called reparative therapy. And the way he got started was he started a Catholic clinic. It may actually have been the world's first Catholic psychotherapy clinic. And people were coming to him who had unwanted same-sex attractions. They were dissatisfied with their same-sex attractions, particularly males who would come to him. And he didn't have any training in this, any graduate training in this. He knew nothing about the causes of same-sex attractions. Can it be changed? But he began by making two observations. The first observation was that men who came to him who appeared guarded and ill at ease, they had a certain defensive stance toward him. He could feel that from them emotionally. Those were men who were more likely to later acknowledge that they had unwanted same-sex attractions, versus, your typical, what we call ever straight guy who just plops down on the couch and complains about his life. And, so my father made that first observation that, some of these guys have a different stance, or what my father later called defensive detachment. That was one observation. The second observation was that the men with same-sex attractions were often describing the same family patterns, the same family background. And so my father did some investigation into the psychological literature, and he discovered that there's an entire body of literature about this topic that's not being discussed by the mainstream psychological associations. And so he examined this and he came up with this theory. And the basic premise of his theory was this. And this, he saw over 1,000 or more men in his over his career, but over time he developed it into this basic idea that as kids grow up, they go through different developmental stages. An 8-year-old and a 5-year-old are going through different developmental things. And for anyone who's a listener who or a viewer right now who has kids, they know this. The kids are all about one thing at one age, and they'll drop that and be totally into something else at a different age. And kids go through these developmental stages, and it's identical developmental stages for boys and girls up until about 2.5 years of age. 2.5 years of age is what psychologists call the gender identity phase of development. That is the first time that a boy has an additional developmental task that the girl does not have, which is to disidentify from the mother and identify with the father. Now, up until this point, kids come into the world identified with their mothers. I mean, the mother is the primary person in their life. And I mean, even before they're born, I mean, we see from infant studies that a newborn is more responsive to the mother than anybody else, because the infant has been hearing that voice for months in the womb, and there's breastfeeding, and so the mother is the primary identification and attachment figure. But at 2.5, the boy has the additional developmental task to disidentify from the mother and identify with the father. And the idea is that in some homes, this gender identity phase is more difficult for the boy to successfully go through. And the constellation of factors is distant, detached critical father, sometimes over-involved, higher anxiety, sometimes intrusive mother, and temperamentally sensitive son. If you put these factors together, it may increase the probability that the boy will have difficulty at that phase of development. There could be other factors. A bullying older brother is one example, but the boy will try to reach out to the father in these circumstances and try to connect. And if the father doesn't reciprocate, the boy experiences a hurt. He retreats back to the mother and doesn't make that gender identity shift. And as these boys get older, females are their closest friends. They know girls like the back of their hand. But boys, they are having difficulty connecting in that male world, and boys seem intimidating. Boys seem intriguing and mysterious. And as years go on, these guys lack that male attention, affection, approval. There's a hunger, an unmet need, a hunger. And a lot of my clients will say to me, even before they had same-sex attraction, they knew they had same-sex attractions. They'll say, my father held out a standard for me of what it is to be a male, and simultaneously he did not equip me to meet that standard. So he held out that standard. He continued to hold out. He didn't give me the equipping I needed to be what my father judged to be an adequate male. And I, as the boy, grew up in the frustration of that discrepancy. And then years later on, early adolescence, sexual attractions kick in, and they're not directed towards females who seem safe and familiar, but they're directed toward males who seem exotic and mysterious and exciting. And for many of my clients, they will say that the gay label brought a sense of relief because they feel like I don't have to be striving for that what felt like an unattainable standard of maleness. I get to take on the gay label. So now I'm a different kind of guy. I'm a different guy, and the gay label, on one hand, it brings relief, like, oh, there's a reason why I have these feelings. But the gay label also brings a sense that it reinforces the boy's notion that he really is different from other males around him. He's a different kind of guy. It confirms that sense of differentness, and that's a painful thing. So my father developed this theory. He has all these books. People, if they're interested, they can find it on josephnicolosi.com. Find videos and all that information, a bunch of free resources. But that was his basic theory. And so I am also a clinical psychologist. I'm approaching this topic in my own different way. But I see the stories over and over. I've treated 500 men, and overwhelmingly, it's the same pattern that my father described. And it's something that we are not being told about from the psychological establishment. It's not being portrayed in the media, but many people say that this model resonates for them.
Yeah. Thank you for that overview. And yeah, I'm really excited to try to just tease out, especially the parenting and the fatherhood implications of what you're describing. But I assume people listening to this are going to maybe start with kind of surprise, like, wait, that's like, do we even know anything about the causes? My experience was, it seemed like within the Christian community, there was sort of like a bias of, well, if you have a same-sex attraction, you've done something wrong, you've chosen this. There was a lot of judgment around this. And in order to kind of put a stop to that, there was kind of a born this way. There's got to be a gene. We're going to find a gene someday. We don't really know exactly what it is, but we know it has zero to do with choice. It's likely not even related to nurture. And there seems like there's now theories around, kind of like a in utero kind of trying to explain, since they can't find a genetic link, they got to go as far back as possible. And maybe if you could place what you're describing, Dr. Nicolosi, alongside like the sort of the going theories, and kind of give us some context as to why there isn't a consensus around what is the root causes of same-sex attraction in males.
There are different theories, you're right. And there isn't a consensus, perhaps due to a socio-political bias, due to an ideological bias. The psychological community is an ideological monoculture in which you do not challenge the mainstream narratives on the topic of LGBT. Even if it's evidence-based, it's like that's you're considered a pariah. So I think that's a part of what we're seeing. But yes, look, there may be a genetic situation here. There may be a genetic predisposition, but a predisposition and a determinant are two different things.
Okay.
There are many things that are predispositions that we all have, but those are not things that make us do a certain behavior or feel a certain feeling, especially not something as complex as human sexuality. So there are several theories. One is it's genetic, although that theory has been dying down dramatically, because if there's any, once you investigate that theory and you think about this, like if there were a gene that instructed an organism, any organism, to couple with members of the same sex versus opposite sex, that's a self-destruct gene. So it can't simply be a matter of genetics. And they think, well, maybe it's nature and nurture. Maybe there's a theory about the mothers, the having other older, if they have multiple boys, then maybe later on, as they have more boys, it affects the mother's hormones, and so it will change the boy's brain. That's called the maternal immune hypothesis. But I think the best information that we can find is, let me tell you what I suspect may be going on, and then I'll tell you what I think. There could certainly be a genetic predisposition to a certain degree. I think there could be something to the maternal immune hypothesis, which might be moving the needle 2 or 3%. I think these things are moving the needle 2 or 3%. But I think that the evidence for the environment is very strong. So let me just tell you this. So possibly the best way to tease out how much of this is genetic and how much isn't is to look at twin studies. Now, there's a big twin study in the 1990s that showed that if you have genetically identical twins, that if one of the twins, we're talking about males today, so I'm just going to talk about males. If one of the twins was gay identified, there was a 50% chance that the other genetic twin would be gay identified. And people said, see, this is evidence of a gene. Well, not so fast. So first of all, 50%, right off the bat, we know that already 50% is probably environmental. But then we have to go, oh, well, wait a second, these kids were raised in the same environment. So there's something to do with that. What we would have to do is look at genetically identical twins who were separated at birth in two different environments, literally from day one. And there's small studies, just a couple small studies, because that's very hard to find. And those studies seem to indicate that the concordance rate is somewhere between 5 and 10%, not 50%. It's somewhere roughly 5 to 10%.
Okay.
This would indicate to us that this is predominantly related to the environment.
Okay. So the theory that you're laying out has to do with trauma that occurred with the boy in the course of his development at a particular point, maybe about 2.5 years old. Does it suggest that you're not necessarily born homosexual or heterosexual? You have you're a predisposition to be sexually attracted to the other, and then something kind of in your environment changes the way that you like whether or not females versus males are seen as mysterious, different. Like, describe a little bit more. And I know that there's also a little bit later in the development, if you get past that 2.5 years, are there other traumas that tend to trigger same-sex attraction?
So because of the specificity of your question, I'm going to give you a more specific answer, and
Okay.
we're going to get detailed here about this. So part of the theory that my father developed is that gender identity, and this isn't all from him, there were many theorists going back before him, but gender identity, its development is in some ways kind of like cement. When you pour cement, it's going to start to harden, but the hardening is going to happen earlier on, and then it's going to slow down later on. So most of cement may harden in whatever the first 30 minutes, but it's continuing to harden over the next 3 hours. It's just that the rate is slowing down. So gender identity may be really very malleable around 2.5, but over the subsequent years, it's gonna start to slow down. So there might be other traumatic factors that may influence the boy's sense of insecurity in his gender identity. So one might be sexual abuse when he's older. Maybe early.
How often is that the case?
In my practice, 33% of my clients were sexually abused. They
Okay.
can point to a specific moment where they say, I did not have these attractions until that day.
Okay.
I maybe didn't feel that secure as a guy, but from that point forward, that's when these attractions started. So that's about a third of my clients. Um, and another component could be a lot of bullying that's something my clients will report. Um, and in the gay world, we're going to get kind of graphic here, but in the gay world, this is the term tops and bottoms. Some guys are more masculine and some guys are more feminine.
Yeah.
And it may be that the guys who are more feminine had the earlier, this is a hypothesis here, but the guys earlier on had the stronger gender identity trauma, and then those later on, they nickname them tops in the gay world, they may have had the trauma later on. So they have a relatively secure or more secure sense of gender identity in their maleness, but there's an insecurity there. So that's one hypothesis.
Okay.
The Family Plan Calendar is the new way to keep your family team organized. Plan your rhythms, menu, household chores, and notes for the family all in one place. Visit familyteams.com to purchase.
I'd love to understand how broad or how free is this conversation? You mentioned that the kind of the world of psychology is a monoculture that kind of like enforces sort of an ideology. It's like they're coming to a conclusion and then they're finding evidence for that conclusion. And so it seems like any kind of attack on the ability to do a research, evidence-based discovery of these things. How long has that been going on? Was there a time where there was more of a consensus or more freedom? Because when I think about the history, this is one of the most interesting and I think critical questions to try to answer within the world of psychology, especially today. Give me maybe a little bit more of the history. How far back does the kind of more environmental hypothesis go?
Well, let me answer your first question about the field of psychology. Earlier on in the field of psychology and in the field of medicine, when people would ask themselves, what is healthy? Healthy, and this goes back to the ancient Greeks and probably even further, healthy is that which functions according to its design. That which functions according to its design is what we consider to be healthy. And now, since we have moved toward postmodernism, there's no design, there's no designer, and all we're left with is when we have this vacuum here, an ontological vacuum where you can create yourself and be whoever you want to be. When we ask ourselves, well, what's healthy? Healthy becomes, well, do you accept yourself? Do you accept yourself? You're healthy. If you don't accept yourself, you're not healthy. And so this goes back to something much earlier. We're going from modernism to postmodernism. We're going from the concept that there is an objective truth, there is a design, there are standards, to postmodernism. And so that postmodernism probably really took off in the beginnings in the 1960s. We saw in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association changed their diagnostic criteria about whether or not homosexuality is a disorder or not. But around that time, that was when we were starting to see postmodern anthropological views really take off, and how your subjective feeling is the ultimate determinant, not just about sexuality, just in general. If you're feeling good about it, then it's probably healthy.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what the state of things are within psychology, especially within licensed clinical psychology. But if an adult male says, I do think that, to your point, what is healthy is for me to find a way to engage in a heterosexual monogamous marriage. Is it possible? Is it legal for him to get help to try to achieve that goal?
In California in 2018, we got close to the point where it would have been illegal for an adult.
Wow.
Thankfully, that there was a bill that in 2018 that was pulled at the last minute, and they did not put it to the final vote. But that's what they were going for. So in California, we are very close to the point where an adult could come into a psychotherapist and say, "Look, I'm sexually confused," and the therapist can say, "I can affirm you toward LGBT." We get all these different layers, but if you want to explore heterosexual monogamy, that is illegal. And if anyone doubts what I'm saying, I doubt viewers of your show would think that this isn't true, but in case anyone wants to know,
Yeah.
the bill is AB 2943, and that was in California, and that was a close one. And
Wow.
so there are some places where treating an adult, like Canada, could, in some instances, be criminal for the psychotherapist.
Wow. Even if that's the request of the adult. I mean, it seems so bizarre in that in a world that has been trying to uh, put forward that freedom's the highest value, that we need to live in, that's been the argument, in favor of a lot of these ideas. But it seems to only go in one direction. And so when it comes to minors, so a parent has a child who has recently come to them and describes unwanted same-sex attraction or same-sex feelings. What is legal in that case? So you've got somebody who's 15, 16-year-old boy who is saying, look, I am struggling with these thoughts. I don't really want them. Are these feelings? What's the kind of the current state of the law? What can parents do if their desire is to help see if this is something that, if this is, these are unwanted feelings, this is something that can be explored?
You're talking about California?
Yeah, California. Maybe give me the kind of the sense of where this is. Is this is a state by state question at this
It's
point?
state by state. If
Okay.
you're in California and you're in that situation, I would certainly say consider moving. And
Okay.
I'm in California. Like I'm here. Um, so yeah, it depends on the state. There are
Right.
probably about half the states it's no problem to talk to help your kid. But in half the states, yeah, you got a 16-year-old kid and the kid says, I have some heterosexual feelings and some homosexual feelings. The therapist is going to feel really under pressure. Like maybe I can affirm only some of these feelings, but I can't help affirm the other one.
Okay.
It's very difficult. And part of it is because these laws are broad, vague, and designed to present a chilling effect for anyone who would affirm these kids toward heterosexuality. Now, I don't even know if we would affirm these kids. It's about helping these kids explore what's going on in them. So in the therapy that I do, I'm not even affirming anybody in any particular direction. In the therapy I'm doing, which is called reintegrative therapy. Go to reintegrativetherapy.com if you want to know more. We have videos and the peer-reviewed data, and a new research study is coming out in like 10 days from now on our work. But if you're interested, basically, we're treating trauma. We're treating trauma. We're using the same evidence-based treatment methods that we find in other fields of study. We're treating trauma, and we're helping clients develop attachment security. And
Mm.
as we focus on that, yes, we do see changes in their sexuality. We see this over and over and over. And the new data is starting to come out to show this.
Okay. And I think so. Help me understand. Obviously there's been a lot of controversy around the idea of sort of conversion therapy. And I remember, 20, 30 years ago, there was sort of an open question. I think a lot of this has to do with, is this discredited that's even possible? Are people sort of cemented, like you were describing that slow hardening cement? Is this something that's just so cemented that it's just inappropriate and actually damaging to try to help anyone, even if their desire is to move in a heterosexual direction? That itself is going to do damage. And so you have these laws that were passed, I guess, I know there was a lot of, it sounds like a state by state against anything. And I remember there was ministries at the time, like Exodus, that you would send your kids to. And there was so much media around it. And I feel like there was a sudden like shift in the Overton window. People are familiar with that idea, like where what is acceptable to talk about. And this was like an open question. Like, is this a good idea? Does this work? Is this damaging? It was an open conversation. Then all of a sudden, 10, 15 years ago, it closed like and locked. And I never heard the conversation again really come up. It was like, no, we've settled this. This is always wrong. And so, yeah, give me some nuance in terms of like what happened. Anything you would say about sort of that story that occurred over the last 20, 30 years, how the language has changed and where things are at today. Where would you say we're at in terms of having maybe an open conversation around, is it appropriate to enter into any kind of therapeutic relationship in which the hope is to put more weight on somebody's heterosexual feelings as opposed to same-sex attraction?
Okay, so I think in order to set the stage for how it could be done in an ethical way, we have to start by defining some terms. One is change. When we talk about change, we're not talking about flipping a light switch from gay to straight. And critics of the kind of therapy that I do would claim that these therapy, that my therapy or therapies like it are we're holding out a promise that we're going to flip the switch. This is not about flipping a switch. We're not flipping a light switch. We're talking about rotating a light dimmer. We're talking about gradual degrees of varying kinds. They're different for each person. So we should define what change means at the outset. We should also think about how everybody should be free to find therapy and support to help them achieve their desired goals and outcomes. So when we're talking about client-led therapy, the client is leading it. The therapist is not making promises about any outcome, regardless of any marital therapy, any kind of therapy. The therapist, I think, should not be making guarantees of outcome. And when we understand that change is on degrees of the spectrum rather than categorical, like flipping a light switch, then I think we can start to approach the topic of looking at how some therapies do seem to shift sexuality. And so there are new studies coming out saying that yes, sexuality does change for some people. And what's very interesting about the new studies is that we're seeing that sexuality change is coming as a byproduct of other processes. Now, this was not going on in the ex-gay ministries 10 or 15 years ago. In the ex-gay ministries, I think you were alluding to, sexuality change was the goal. That's the focus. That's the guarantee. Now we're seeing that there's from new neuroscientific data that, again, anyone who's interested, go to reintegrativetherapy.com, click on science, and see what I'm talking about. But there are other things that people can do, such as trauma treatment, as one example. And these other things that we're doing are causing shifts in sexuality as a byproduct, spontaneous byproduct. And those shifts appear to be lasting. So the next study that's coming out in a week or two, whenever soon, is a randomized placebo-controlled study that we did. And we did 2 follow-ups to make sure that these effects are lasting. And the methods that we used that we compared against placebo were all methods where people were not trying to change their sexuality. The effects were happening on their own.
Okay. Well, that's very helpful to kind of get caught up on what happened. There was such a strong aversion. And I think that everyone seemed to admit that there was a framing like you're describing that was inappropriate, that those ministries were kind of using, and it created sort of a backlash on every kind of therapy that would possibly be used, and it kind of closed the whole conversation down and created all these laws and these reactions. So I think one of the things I'm most interested in, Dr. Nicolosi, is trying to understand the implications for fatherhood. Like a lot of the folks who are listening to this are dads who are trying to raise multi-generational families. Like a big part of what we're about is we want to see families be fruitful. We want to see them multiply. We want to see them have grandchildren. We want to see like flourishing. To your point, we have a blueprint in Genesis 1 of the design of what healthy looks like. And we want to make sure that we're living a life in line with God's word and with God's intent for humanity. And so what I'm trying to understand is that from what you're uncovering, what your father discovered in his theories around the causes of same-sex attraction, what are some of the big do's and don'ts that you would just say to a father who is raising boys? And obviously, I think we're both aware that this entire conversation was going to sound deeply homophobic to anyone who doesn't think that there is a design or is a good reason to want to raise a family in a way that allows for especially sons to someday be fathers. But we're really unambiguously interested in that. And I really want to understand, what are we learning about attachment, like you said, fatherhood? And you even mentioned like sibling relationships, like with an older brother, which is something that also has, I think, a component that is a big part of this. So yeah, I'd love to give me any thoughts that you've learned in all of your clinical practice with men.
The 2 sources of information that I can draw upon is the 500 men I've treated and the literature on this topic. So yes, well, first let's start with the literature. So I came prepared because I know your channel is about fathers. So I have a paper here, and this paper by Sherry Golden, the relationship between father involvement and father role confidence in fathers of gay sons. Anyone can look this up. You can find this free online. But in her article, Golden measured 70 fathers of gay identified men, and she used three well-established psychological assessments. And what came as a result of her investigation was she found that these fathers were shown to exhibit indirect, non-nurturing, or low engagement types of father involvement activities with their gay identified sons, rather than direct, nurturing, and high engagement activities. And so what she did was she did something very interesting, because many people will say, this is pretty clear. Even gay affirmative therapists and researchers would say, okay, fine. We know that there's often a conflict between the boy with same-sex attractions and the relationship with the father. We see this pretty clearly in the literature. But the gay affirmative explanation for that is that the boy is gay. He's born gay, and he'll always be gay. And the father is picking up on the boy's effeminacy. And so consciously or unconsciously, the father is distancing himself. He's withdrawing from the boy, probably due to the father's own internalized homophobia, because we live in a patriarchal, homophobic society. And so that is the explanation for why there's this separation between fathers. There's a strained relationship between fathers and gay sons. So Sherry Golden did an interesting test. She wanted to see which came first. Was it that the boy is born gay and the father's picking up on it, or is that strained relationship with the father, is it a causative role? Is it a contributing factor to the boy's homosexuality? It's very difficult to test this out. So what Sherry Golden did is she examined the father's relationships with their own fathers, because we know that as men, we tend to, then this could be this could be a liability or a benefit depending on who our fathers were, but we tend to father the way we were fathered. And so Sherry Golden looked at the fathers and their relationship with their own father, and that study confirmed that those fathers, when we go back to their relationship with their own father, that was a predictor of how those men fathered their gay identified sons. And she saw a similar pattern of having less father involvement, less engagement over time. So there was something intergenerational that Sherry Golden's work uncovered. So I think back to your question, Jeremy, about what can fathers do? Well, fathers can know about the evidence that there's something going on in the paternal line. There's an intergenerational transmission of attachment dynamic that's going on here. And according to Golden's work, it's indirect, non-nurturing, and low engagement. And perhaps those things are being paired with a temperamentally sensitive son. And when you put those factors together, that's not going to work for that son. The son, to make a strong attachment, it's up to the father. It's incumbent upon the father to bridge that, because you can't expect that of a young son. So the father has to modify his parenting according to what Golden's work is showing us.
I see. So you have a temperamentally pretty sensitive boy with potentially a father who's, maybe through hypermasculinity, or if he does detach, the causative is not necessarily a correlation, but a causative element could be the decision to, or just the multi-generational pattern of distancing himself from his son. And it also involves often a inadvertent deep attachment with a mother that's unhealthy. Is that usually a part of the pattern?
A lot of my clients have described, not all, but a lot of them had described what they called an enmeshed relationship with their mother, where my role in the family is to take care of mom's needs, and her role is to take care of. So she manages my emotions, and I manage her emotions. And so that is something that I often hear, and they often describe their mothers as higher anxiety.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. A lot of the tension that I've heard erupt around this topic is, now that we have gay marriage, there is even a more visceral reaction to the idea that someone who has same-sex attraction deciding to enter into a heterosexual marriage, that it just doesn't work. It won't last. He's going to battle with this, and then there's going to be and I think we've all seen this. I mean, this is a pattern. So what would you say if you're talking to a man who's like, I really want to live in a heterosexual monogamous marriage, is this a good idea? Is this a safe thing to try to build a family? Does it depend a lot on the degree of the same-sex attraction? Like how does somebody sort of think through this question about is it wise? Is it safe? Is it fair to my wife and to my future family to enter into a heterosexual marriage? Like I'm curious again because this is so politicized. I'm not hearing like any really like especially clinical level analysis of what to say to somebody in this situation.
That is a very important question because that question has a political component, a social component, a familial component, possibly a religious component, sexual. So that's a
Yeah.
nexus of so many different things. So as a clinical psychologist, I should only parse out the psychological component.
Okay.
There was research done by anyone can look this up. Beckstead and Rossick are two researchers who did some very recent and innovative research investigation into this. And my understanding of their work, as I've read through it, is that a very good predictor of marital satisfaction is honesty. So is the man being totally real with the woman before marriage? Hey, these are my struggles. This is what's going on. That has been shown to be a very, very, very big predictor. And with Rossick and Beckstead's research, they were specifically looking at religious couples, and they called these something like mixed orientation marriages. So the guy admitted his same-sex attraction. Anyway, they found that if there is honesty, and I personally am wondering some degree of heterosexuality. If those factors are there, then according to the research, yes, they can be just as happy. They have equal levels of satisfaction, marital satisfaction, as non-mixed orientation couples. I can tell you from my clinical practice of working with my clients, when my clients go on to date and they get married, what the woman often says she needs the most is to know that she's really being pursued by the man and that she is really someone that he desires. Many of the women I work with who are the partners or the wives of my clients, they will say, I don't really care that much about your past. I don't really care that much about what you did 10, 20 years ago. That's not that important. My bottom line is, are you interested in me? Are you really passionate and committed to me? I want to be able to feel secure in your love and your attraction. That is the single greatest predictor for me, to have the attachment security that I need to remain in this marriage. And many of, I'll tell you one thing. I wasn't planning on saying this, but we had a staff meeting at our clinic. A whole bunch of therapists are there. We had we had about 7 or 8 or 9 therapists there. And we were saying, can we think of any of our clients who didn't tell his wife before marriage about his same-sex attractions? And of those men, are any of them in a happy marriage? And of all the therapists, and we're talking collectively, that's like thousands of patients we've seen, we could not find a single one. Not a single one. Honesty is crucial to attachment security. So that's a roundabout way of trying to give you the best answer that I can give you, Jeremy.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's been it's such a tricky issue, and I think that's interesting that attachment is a huge component, and honesty upfront. That's what if you aim at that. Yeah, it's obviously so tricky, and anyone like you spelled out, there are so many different variables that have to be considered in a decision like that. I think one of the things that a lot of times I'm sure people struggle with when it comes to the theories that we're describing, we're exploring for the cause of same-sex attraction. I picture a father who just is crushed with guilt. It feels like it's completely his fault. And oftentimes the rejoinder to any of these kinds of theories is to find one person who is well known and says, I have same-sex attraction and I had an amazing relationship with my dad. We were so well attached, and he's a hero of mine, and he spent time with me, and so it seems like that just torpedoes the discussion immediately. I'm curious how these are kind of two questions, but how do you deal with the exceptions to what we're describing here? Do those exist in your opinion? And then I would love to sort of talk a connection with that to the father. How do they process if they suddenly discover that their son is struggling with same-sex attraction? Does he feel like the root cause of it? So I'd like to hit each of those, if you would mind.
Let's start with the first one, the rejoinder that you mentioned.
Yeah.
My father, the best father, our relationship was perfect. It was great.
Yeah.
Okay, so all I can say as a clinical psychologist is, if I'm acting within my professional capacity, I can't say to some guy, no, you're wrong. It was a terrible relationship and you just are not willing to look at it. Or I don't know. I don't know this guy. I'm not here to invalidate some other person's story. All I can say as a clinical psychologist is what are the themes that I see most frequently in my clinical practice, and what does the scientific literature indicate to us, including the monozygotic twin studies, including Sherry Golden's work with the intergenerational patterns with the fathers. So all I can say is this is what we are seeing over and over and over. Is this a cookie cutter theory where it works with every single person, a conveyor belt, and people come in and we impose the same theory on every person? No, of course, there's going to be differences for every individual, but these are the themes that we see most often. And I think two areas where psychologists get themselves into trouble is, number one, when psychologists try to be moral arbiters. It's not our job to be a moral arbiter. We're not religious figures. We have no authority to tell people morally what they should do or shouldn't do. And the other thing is when we make these blanket statements about all people. I've never met all people, and as a clinician, I can't judge all people. So that's how I would respond to the rejoinder that you mentioned. In terms of the relationships in terms of the fathers who feel crushed by this, I'd say that perhaps the best way to approach this topic is naming, not blaming. We're not here to assign, I am certainly not here to assign a moral judgment to anybody. Science is not about right versus wrong. Science is about cause and effect. This happened, then in the timeline this happened, and there seems to be a causative connection between these variables. That's all I can say. I'm not here to morally judge anyone, but for those fathers who are listening to this, I'd say try to frame it in terms of naming, not blaming, and just see it from that perspective. And if anything, frankly, Golden's work would say in some ways that the father is not as culpable as we think. We need to look at the father within the larger framework of his own life, that this has been going on through his intergenerational line. And maybe the father had a different temperament or a different relationship with his own mother. And that's why his father's indirect, non-nurturing, low engagement parenting didn't have an impact on him in terms of impacting his sexuality. So it's a larger perspective, and no one person is the person that I am certainly trying to assign blame to.
Okay.
Are you following us on Facebook and Instagram yet? Look up @FamilyTeams to get even more free content and never miss out on event announcements.
Well, I'd love to kind of make sure that I'm fully understanding at least the major contributors. So we've talked about temperament. So there's a certain kind of temperament that a boy may have that could, none of these seem like they're causative necessarily by themselves, but they're sort of like a stacking effect. So you've got a certain kind of temperament. You have a low nurturing father. You have and it may be distant emotionally. You have a very involved or enmeshed relationship with the mother. You mentioned that there's sort of like a moment at 2.5, and then there's another moment or other moments in the development. What are other contributing factors that you've noticed both in the literature and in your practice beyond these? You mentioned sexual abuse at some point. Yeah, there are other major variables.
Sexual abuse and bullying.
Bullying.
And specifically, not just any bullying, it's bullying specifically about the boy's gender. It's a specific kind of bullying where the boy is made to feel ashamed about his gender, that he is inadequate in his maleness on a fundamental level. That, at least for my clients, that is big time. When these guys come into my clinic, that is like the most common trauma that my clients want to work on, which is feeling estranged by other males and feeling fundamentally inadequate in their maleness. But yes, we also hear about the sexual abuse, and it's not just any sexual abuse. What is particularly pernicious for my clients is when the sexual abuse occurred in the context of a relationship with a trusted caregiver. So a trusted caregiver paired the sexual abuse with some kind of an emotion that my client was hungering for. we call attention, affection, approval, something like that. And in the course of giving the client or meeting the client's needs, emotional needs, then the sexual abuse is introduced. That is particularly pernicious because for the client, he's trying to tease out how much of this is my own sexuality and how much of this was I groomed, was I manipulated? And that is very difficult. And that's, I can tell you, a third of my clients, that is a major focus of the psychotherapy.
Wow. Well, you mentioned that being comfortable with your gender, and this is, it's interesting today. There's a movement to essentially make every child question their gender, right? Like that's not widespread at this point, but I think it's growing. That sort of removes the choice that this person may have by assigning them a gender at birth or by constantly. I would say the very least part of what this trend has created is a sense of like a lack of confidence to really emphasize masculinity, how it's good if you're a boy, and femininity, and how beautiful it is to be a girl and to someday become a mother. If we had a culture that was really good at affirming gender, where everybody believed that gender was God-given and something that we wanted to at the earliest age possible, instead of minimize gender, like let's say maximize gender in a healthy way. Would you say that from your experience, that would be a positive move? This move of sort of making an increasingly androgynous culture, parent number one, parent number two. One of the strangest examples was when the publisher of Roald Dahl's books decided to remove all of the problematic words in his books, Charlie and Chocolate Factory, and father and mother were among the problematic words. And so this movement of like trying to remove gender, if one of the issues that men have is getting to a place of comfort with their masculinity, how would you say that this movement is going to impact boys and girls of the future? And is there anything you would say that as fathers, we should in particular do to help our young boys be comfortable with their masculinity?
You're making a good point. We are currently in the midst of a massive social experiment in degendering our society and our children. And so the long-term effects of this will probably not be known for 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah.
We'll need that longitudinal data to see what's going on. I'm in California, as I mentioned. So the California public schools and what they're teaching children in the curriculum now, we don't really know long-term what that's really going to do to kids. But I can tell you that my clients will say, I really, really appreciated when I felt affirmed by other males, when I felt genuinely that my other male peers saw me as a guy among guys, when they treated me as a guy among guys, when they treated me the way they treated their other peers, I felt that for me was very reassuring. And so I can say from what my clients tell me, that has been very healing for them.
Yeah. One of the most unusual statistics that I've ever heard about same-sex attraction, I'm curious if you would confirm this, that is it like the second brother syndrome, or like, so this is like a effect where if you have an older brother, the second born or a younger brother is more likely to have same-sex attraction. And it seems like this really contributes potentially to the theory that you're describing. Maybe draw that together. Is that true? Is that one of the more unusual findings that I've heard that from the LGBTQ community? I've heard that for the last 10 or 15 years, this is an unusual finding. And I was like, well, that's such an unusual thing that it seems like that would help us zero in on a variable. But it seems like there's a reticence to look at variables. And so, yeah, what would you say that does say about the variables?
To your observation about the reticence to look for variables, that could be because behind all of this is a worldview challenge. There are, shall we say, some prevailing worldviews that have a vested interest in not examining any variables, because under the prevailing worldviews, people are ontologically LGBTQ, whatever they are, and they cannot change. So when we look for variables, it starts to break apart the worldview like a house of cards. So that might be behind the reticence. But to your point, so this gets very complicated. And I'm going to do the best I can.
Sure.
So there's something called the maternal immune hypothesis, which connects to another theory called the fraternal birth order effect. So here we go. So the fraternal birth order effect is the observation that the more older brothers one has, the more likely that, if it's a male, the more likely that individual will have same-sex attractions. If you have two older brothers, you have a certain factor. If you have 3 or 4 older brothers, now your probability of having same-sex attractions is even higher. Okay. So people would say, well, look, the people who have the environmental angle on this topic, they think there's an environmental component, they'd say, sure, you're more likely to possibly be sexually abused. You're more likely to have a bullying older brother. The father is just zapped. The guy's got 4 kids, 4 sons, and now a 5th kid comes along. How much male attention, affection, approval can this guy possibly give? So we're now slicing, each kid gets a thinner slice of the emotional resources from the father. The response to that is, well, there's some data which, when we look at the father who has died, or the adoption situations, they would say still we can parse it out and say, well, look, there's still the fraternal birth order effect, because even if that kid is boy number 4, for example, and he gets adopted out, he's still more likely to have same-sex attractions. Explain that. That's the response. So they use something called the maternal immune hypothesis to attempt to explain this. The maternal immune hypothesis is that the more boys a mother gives birth to, or even is just pregnant with, the more it's going to affect her hormones, and those hormones will affect the fetus, because the mother is sensing, the mother's body comes to respond to androgens, the male sex hormone, as an invader, and it creates an immune response, and so that may have an impact on the boys' brains. So it all gets very complicated. Let me summarize it. The more boys the mother has, the more the mother may respond to the androgens in subsequent pregnancies by creating an immune response, and that immune response may affect the boy's brain and feminize it, and then he may be more likely to have same-sex attractions. Okay, so that, if you go to the Wikipedia page on this, there's a ton of data. I mean, you'd think this is the most scientific thing in the entire world. There's just a couple problems with this. One problem is that the newest data, using larger sample sizes, is starting to say, well, actually, the connection is not as strong as we thought with the fraternal birth order effect. And we're starting to see this with lesbians. We're starting to see the more sisters, the more a girl may be likely to be lesbian. So that throws the whole thing into a mix. Maybe this has nothing to do with maleness, because the girl isn't going to be producing androgens like the boy is in utero. My field is in a lot of confusion. And right now, late 2024, the maternal birth order effect is being challenged. I think what we've got to look at is the monozygotic twins, and looking at the twin studies, especially when you separate out those twins on day 1. And that may be our best way of parsing out how much of this is environmental, how much of this is genetic. And if those monozygotic twin studies are accurate, and it's a strong argument, then what we're seeing is predominantly an environmental influence on the development of same-sex attractions in boys.
Okay. Well, thanks for going into that. Each of these theories, one of the things I keep on running up against is like you're to your point, it's like they're presented as a consensus, like, oh, we figured it out, here it is, and if it fits the worldview, then it's immediately adopted and supported, and if it violates the worldview, then you're going to have major challenges. And so often it's just completely silenced. And one of the things I love about getting to do podcasts is that we can have these conversations kind of out in the open now and really explore these possible variables and these theories that are just not getting nearly enough airtime. And so, Dr. Nicolosi, I just want to thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of you and your father's work, everything you guys have done to really wade into one of the most politically fraught areas. Please let people know, how can people follow your work? Articles, books, websites. Let people know how to find you.
Thank you. My father's website is josephnicolosi.com, josephnicolosi.com. Videos, interviews. If you go to the website and put in your email right now, we'll give you 2 free chapters of his book, audio chapters or written chapters. All of that's on there, his debates and his interviews on Oprah and Bill O'Reilly and Dr. Phil and Dr. Drew and all that stuff. And so people may find that interesting. The website of the nonprofit that I am working with now is called the Reintegrative Therapy Association. You can go to reintegrativetherapy.com, reintegrativetherapy.com. Watch what these actual sessions look like. Add your email to the email list. We have this study coming out next week. You'll get all the data on that when it comes out, and see what the psychological establishment does not want you to know.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Dr. Nicolosi. Appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.